Hello and welcome to the Whitehall Sources podcast, where we take you inside politics at Westminster. I'm Callum MacDonald. Hello. And also on the podcast, Kirsty Buchanan, who is a special advisor to the Prime Minister Theresa May. Hello, Kirsty.
Good morning.
And Joe Tanner, political strategist. Hello, Joe.
Hello.
Lovely to be with you on a Saturday morning. I'm not going to use the phrase emergency podcast because I think that's overused by lesser podcasts than ours. However, we are here unexpectedly.
A reflective podcast. An exciting and unexpected week at Westminster.
That's right. A reflective, unexpected pod, which of course is focusing on the departure of Angela Rayner as Deputy Prime Minister, as Housing Secretary, and indeed as Deputy Leader of the Labour Party, and the really quite major reshuffle that followed for Sir Keir Starmer and his government. Your own reflections are very welcome today. You can WhatsApp us on 0333 404 6507 and start your message with the word Whitehall, or you can email us hello@whitehallsources. I actually just want to read a message from Pete, who's got in touch via the website whitehallsources.com as well. It's quite a lengthy message, so I won't read every bit of it, but he says, "Hi Callum, Kirsty and Joe. As the owner of a small and growing business, I am yet again bewildered at the PM's appointments for Department of Business and Trade after this week's reshuffle. From my limited research on the department's ministerial team, I see only one junior minister who has any experience in a leadership role in business, this being Baroness Gustafsson, who, if you'll forgive me, I'm not sure anyone outside Parliament has heard of or from, but it's a start. However, Peter Kyle was an aid worker, Sarah Jones was a press officer, Gareth Thomas was a teacher, Justin Madders was a solicitor, Baroness Jones was a trade union official. These are all laudable outside Parliament jobs, but none provide them with an understanding of what running or leading a business is." He goes on to say, "Why do you think no other parties pick up on this when it directly affects the government's key priority, growth, growth, growth?" And I think Pete sets the context for a couple of the conversations we'll have in light of this reshuffle here, which is experience, making sure you've got the right people in the right places, and indeed what this reshuffle says about the government's mission of growth, and indeed some of the other missions too. So thank you, Pete, and hold that thought because we'll return to some of those things throughout the pod today. Kirsty, shall we start with a reflection from you? Angela Rayner has departed. She has resigned after the ethics advisor and an investigation by Sir Laurie Magnus found that she had in fact breached and broken the ministerial code. How big a loss is Angela Rayner? I mean, both politically and I suppose in reality. What impact was she actually having in government? So what damage does it do to the political operation of Sir Keir Starmer, and what damage does it do to his ambitions?
In terms of the impact for Starmer, it is hugely damaging. There is almost within the Labour Party no one quite like Angela. I mean, there are a couple of people that we'll come to talk about when we talk about the deputy leader contest that will ensue, but she was pretty widely well respected and liked within the party. She allowed him the ability to kind of reach to the parts of the party, in the Parliamentary Labour Party, that others didn't. And in a slightly harder way to quantify, but she was also very, very popular with the media. Now, whether that was because she was good copy or whether because she was charismatic and engaging and funny and full of technicolor life in a world where most politicians are navy blue or grey is another matter. But nevertheless, she was a real kind of impactful politician. Having said all that, one of the things that made her technicolor is one of the things that's probably led to her downfall. She has a habit, for someone of such high office, for being remarkably careless in her, let's put it that way, remarkably careless in handling some of her own personal affairs. And the Sir Laurie Magnus letter makes, I think, two critical points. He has determined that she acted in good faith. In other words, this wasn't a deliberate attempt to try and avoid paying taxes on this new house, this new apartment in Hove, but also that she was careless, and that's kind of putting it mildly, in ignoring the advice that she received not once but twice to get proper tax advice about the correct level of stamp duty she needed to pay. He calls that highly unfortunate, deeply regrettable. And ultimately, the overarching responsibility in the ministerial code is to comply with the law. Nobody else that did this would have found the position tenable. It's not tenable or frankly defensible from her. And the court of public opinion on Angela Rayner was frankly much harder than the kind of reflective court of the Westminster bubble, which was very generous in giving her the benefit of the doubt on this. And what the court of public opinion said is, look, here is a flaming hypocrite. Here is a woman who in opposition was utterly uncompromising about the issues that certain cabinet ministers in the Conservative government found themselves unwittingly, or perhaps wittingly in some cases, caught up in. Utterly uncompromising in demanding that they resign. And if you flip the script on this and say this isn't a charismatic, likeable, working-class Labour woman, but a very rich Tory minister, what would she have said about it?
Yeah, I think that's a fair contrast to draw, that in terms of the coverage of this. I mean, Rod Liddell on Times Radio was making the point today that the BBC coverage yesterday was almost funereal. He compared it to the death of Diana. Princess
Hagiographic.
Diana.
The whole thing with the kind of hagiographic air about it.
Yeah, really interesting. Joe, the departure of Rayner, a take from you on this. It's kind of a quite drawn-out process in the end by the time we got to yesterday's departure.
Yeah, I mean, it was drawn out partly because of the way that she gave such a vociferous defence of herself, and then, you know, nothing to see here, nothing to see here. Then it turned into a class war and everyone was attacking her. It was being said because of her background rather than because actually they were justified questions to ask anybody in a position, let alone the person that was responsible for housing within their brief. And then, of course, you know, to some extent, she sort of sped things up by the end, because by then working out that she'd got herself probably into bother because she'd probably had a conversation with somebody and had said there was this rumour that the advice, she had draft advice, further advice we assume, which was the stuff that she'd never actually requested in the first place that her lawyers had told her to get, had suggested that she was in a pickle, shall we say. And then by Wednesday, whether that was a series of conversations took place between Monday and Wednesday, who knows? But it did mean that it sort of dragged out across the week. But actually, you've got to give it to the ethics advisor for being relatively quick. I didn't really think he could have been anything other than relatively quick, because it didn't appear to be that there was a lot of information required to be compiled. It was essentially...
And he was going on holiday, so he didn't want it hanging over him.
You know, did Angela do what she said she did? And was there evidence to back that up or not? I mean, it ultimately didn't come down to a great deal, except I do wonder how long it took or what the negotiation was around that wording, because I thought it was very interesting how sensitively he worded everything. And I wonder, I don't know whether he was influenced by what he saw and perhaps language that had been used around how things related to this trust and her son were worded, and therefore it sort of softened his position. I don't know. You know, he made a point of saying that she'd acted with integrity, but actually she had blatantly not done something that her legal team or her advisors had told her to do. So, you know, we've all used this phrase careless, but ultimately if someone said to me, I'm telling you this, but I'm not actually sure, I think you should get proper advice on it, and then I don't do it, does that really mean I've acted with integrity? When actually I should have done what I was told to do. And then should I have gone out to the media and said nothing to see here, I've done everything, I've been told? I mean, she blatantly said she was given advice that she followed.
Yep.
Well, if she followed the advice she was given, she would have got the other advice. That's the point. So I'm there is a part of me that is a little concerned about whether he was lent upon for the wording of what was written, because I thought it was very interesting. And I don't know whether that was just that he was swayed by what he saw, or it's been suggested that Keir Starmer had the report on, or at least the indication of the report, on Thursday night. Yeah. And it didn't then come out until Friday lunchtime. So I wonder what went on in the middle. Because it was then a hastily written letter, wasn't it? It wasn't, it was a handwritten letter.
Handwritten, yeah.
It was all typed out and done through the official process. So anyway, irrespective of all that, yes, it's been dragged out a bit. Her family's had a rotten time. The house has now had graffiti on it, which I really hate. I hate when it comes to someone's front door. And I do think there is a media issue around actually showing properties and things where people live. Like, I don't like any of that. I think it's a really uncomfortable side of, I don't know if we really have to go into that much detail for it to be a public interest, for the extra bit of the public interest angle to be covered. I hope for her sake, she's being she's getting good advice now, because there are still questions around this whole affair that do need to be answered.
It's an interesting point about the House, Jo. Just one paper decided not to publish any photos at all of her house in Hove because it was impossible to crop the picture in any way that didn't mean that you can identify at least the block of the apartment where she lived. Another paper decided to do that. Having said all that, she's lived in Hove since May with her new partner. She goes out to the local co-op, she puts the bins out. Any punter in Hove would be able to tell you where she lived. So I think it was probably entirely likely that even if no paper had published that, they still would have been able to graffiti it. There's a secondary question for me about the Hove property. Now she's lost her ministerial salary, which cuts about 70,000 out of her income. Can she afford the mortgage on an £800,000 property, even allowing for the fairly chunky deposit that she put down on it? Will she have to sell it anyway? And frankly, will she want to live in it after it's been the subject to so much that's caused her so much chaos and disruption to her life? I don't know.
Yeah, good questions. Absolutely. So then we come to the reshuffle that ensued. This is reported to have been a sort of planned reshuffle, albeit not this timing. This was not what Sir Keir Starmer was expecting. There was due to be this sort of reshuffle later in the autumn, so we had the building blocks in place and just brought things forward. Jo, there's a feeling that because he had it sort of ready to go, that there's this feeling of dissatisfaction with how the cabinet was functioning up until now. I wonder if we should interpret this reshuffle as a new sense of determination from Sir Keir Starmer, that there will be a definition around departments and their objectives and ambitions, and crucially, that the public will see delivery. Can this reshuffle?
It can, but it also can't. There's a sort of, it's only going to really, the proof's going to come out in terms of what actually happens. That what it does suggest to me is that while you say it wasn't planned, there was talk about a pre-conference reshuffle, and then it all got changed into being just a Downing Street operation reshuffle. But it does beg the question that given Yvette Cooper's moved, it does beg the question about what was going on in the Home Office, because interestingly, we all saw this big operation from reform over the summer, and we saw a pretty dismal response from the government in terms of who they put up, what they had to say. There was no attempt to get the agenda, which makes you wonder if half of number 10 had just sort of given up because they had an indication something was coming. But then what about those other departments? It wasn't as if there was a huge effort from the Home Office. They waited until the first day back for Yvette Cooper to then be in the House. And I think she gave a statement where she talked about numbers and stuff from over the summer period. But it was the first sort of half decent response that the government had on anything in relation to immigration that we'd seen, given the agenda had been taken up by reform because they'd had these repeated press conferences. So it sort of makes me wonder if even some of the key players had an indication that they were potentially going to be moving, and therefore I don't really need to show up to do media over the summer. I'm going to enjoy my time with my family because this is going to be someone else's problem in a few weeks. It sort of, the curiousness we all had about the void in the summer now to me says actually we were heading towards something. I don't know whether they then wobbled because of the Rayner stuff and then this narrative about, well, actually a proper reshuffle was supposed to happen after the budget if it was going to happen at all. But we were all headed for at least a lower ranking junior ministerial.
And we had one a few days ago, didn't we?
Well,
we sort of had a mini shuffle.
It was basically number 10, and it was the move of Darren Jones, wasn't it? I mean, that was ultimately what happened. But then it was interesting that this week, as the news about Rayner was coming out, that the ethics advisor was doing his bit, we had the investment minister. We had a story break saying that the investment minister wanted to resign, which makes you wonder again if she'd already said, I'm not happy and I want to go. And they'd said, hold on, we'll do something early in the session just before conference. And this plan to do this manoeuvring, and obviously Darren Jones was being moved into number 10 without being given the cabinet office role, I presume was the sort of plan, but then he's been given a formal cabinet office role as well with the Pat McFadden move. So it sort of says to me that half of this was being done, but I think the timing then basically meant that, I'm sure there was a locked file somewhere. The whiteboard was ready, but actually the final pieces of that jigsaw were not quite done.
Yeah.
And I suspect there was still some negotiating going on. But it does make me wonder now if the reason the summer was so quiet was because there were bigger conversations going on behind the scenes.
Yeah, and the investment minister Gustafsson, who Pete actually mentioned in his message, did quit yesterday as well. Let's.
Sorry, Pete.
Sorry, Pete.
People
so
with
even
business experience in the business department now, 0.
gone.
But you know what? What's really interesting, Pete raises a really interesting point about that business experience thing, which is, reform are actually making a massive thing about saying Tice will repeatedly say what we need. And Farage has said it. He said it on Laura Kuenssberg. What we need are people that have experience of running things. We need more people from business. Tice last week on Sky, Trevor Phillips' show, said we need to just try things like you do in business. And sometimes they'll work and sometimes they won't. And that they keep making this business analogy. They're making a big deal of it. The interesting thing is that one of their very own so-called business experienced MPs, James McMurdoch, was then accused of defrauding the taxpayer over COVID loans. So not the best example of someone in business, really, when you're saying that that's part of your narrative. But Pete's right. The issue about business experience and, I think Johnny Reynolds has actually done quite a good job of listening to business. The industrial strategy all got put back because there were concerns. It was then lauded as being, they had actually listened to business and business concerns. So Reynolds will be a loss, but, Peter Carl's been dealing with a lot of businesses over the tech stuff, so I think will be an interesting move. But, it is a concern. Some people feel that you should have more real-world business experience in government.
And I think we'll come back to this idea of kind of what cabinet secretaries can achieve in 14 months in this context before they're shuffled onto somewhere else. And then somebody has to start kind of from nothing again. Let's come back to that in a sec because I want
Secretary of State or cabinet secretaries.
Sorry, I mean secretaries of state is exactly what I mean. Yeah, exactly.
He's been up since 3:10.
You can, your carelessness, you've got integrity, Callum, but you're being a bit careless with the detail. We'll understand. You won't have
Story of my life.
We'll give
Story
you a
of my life. Yeah, I'm going strong. I've had a Diet Coke to try and fuel me through. I want to turn to
Callum, that's the mistake.
Yeah, that's the problem. Let's turn to some of the personnel. And I want to start actually with Shabana Mahmood, who is now the Home Secretary, Kirsty, replacing Yvette Cooper. Yvette Cooper goes to be Foreign Secretary. David Lammy, who was Foreign Secretary, is now at the Ministry of Justice and is Deputy Prime Minister. That's how that kind of part of the reshuffle is played out. So when it comes to the Home Office, one of the questions we've been kind of wrestling with today is whether Shabana Mahmood's appointment there represents something of a hardening of the kind of right of politics approach that the Home Office needs to take to law and order and immigration.
The reshuffle in general and the appointment of Shabana Mahmood in the Home Office in particular, I think for me represents the peak of Morgan McSweeney's power at number 10. And I say this as someone who is the Chief of Staff of the Prime Minister, Keir Starmer. And I say this as someone that believes that eventually Morgan McSweeney will walk because the inherent tensions within the Labour Party will prove too much. And I think Keir Starmer will eventually tack further to the left or be unable to deliver on that kind of political strategy that Morgan McSweeney has always clearly mapped out, which is to face towards reform, to tack to reform and to try and win back some of that red wall vote, if you like, that they are losing in spades to reform. So Shabana Mahmood is a very, very close ally of Morgan McSweeney's. Pat McFadden going to work and pensions with an extra skills portfolio is also interesting. Again, he is a very close ally of number 10 and has that same enforcer reputation that Shabana Mahmood has. Both of these are no-nonsense, pragmatic politicians, beloved of the blue Labour faction of the party. And I think what's been under kind of reported at the moment is the neutering of David Lammy. So he's been taken from Foreign Secretary and put in Justice. And to avoid that being seen as a hideous demotion, he's also been given the bauble, and it is little more than a bauble, of Deputy Prime Minister. Now, one of the things that David Lammy has been effective on, apart from having a surprisingly good relationship with the Vice President of the United States, J.D. Vance, was pushing number 10 and pushing the government further than it perhaps would have otherwise gone on hardening its stance against Israel over Gaza. I mean, we'll wait and see, but it strikes me as Yvette Cooper is a much more pragmatic politician when it comes to that particular area of contention. And I, for one, will love to see how on earth JD Vance gets on with Yvette Cooper. I cannot imagine these two. I mean, Yvette Cooper is a sensible, pragmatic politician, but she's quite a brittle and prickly kind of character. And I really struggle to imagine that just on a kind of human level, she's going to connect with JD Vance in a way that, a kind of much warmer character like David Lammy's been able to do.
One reporter I spoke to on Times Radio Breakfast this morning, or in fact I think it was Chloe that was doing the interview, it was Alan Tolhurst from Politics Home, and he said that Yvette Cooper wasn't great at projecting strength or this perception of government grip, Joe. And I wonder, actually, with issues like immigration and law and order, when you've got reform chomping at these issues, that just doesn't cut it. Yvette Cooper just actually wasn't performing well enough as Home Secretary in these areas, projecting strength and the government grip.
But is that her fault, or is that the fault of where the government's at? I mean, this is the same old problem you have, right? You can only do so much with what you've got to work with. You still have to have the content. And this has been this was the row. If you think about this was the discussion that was happening at the beginning of the week, that when we saw this phase 2 reset, the number 10 operation, there's this tension between who is delivering the message and how they're delivering the message and how the message is packaged. But then what is the actual message? Because fundamentally, it still comes back to policy, right? And I think, what cake was Yvette Cooper able to bake? You know what I mean? She might have been a master baker. She might know how to work an oven and dab hand with a whisk. But if actually she was being given the wrong flour each time and, the wrong flavourings or whatever, was it just a dog's breakfast at the end of it and not a decent masterpiece that Hollywood would have loved? So the fundamental question comes down to, what is the government actually doing?
Yes, and so, but with that in mind, does this reshuffle refocus that? Is it about immigration? Is it about welfare? Is it about growth? Are they ticking those boxes with this reshuffle?
Well, they've definitely. Let's face it, the Pat McFadden appointment. I was sort of really curious about what was going on with the bringing Darren Jones in. A lot of us were sort of looking, saying, "But hang on a minute, we thought Pat's got this reputation of being the fixer, and Pat's got the reputation of being the doer." And let's face it, Pat was supposed to be responsible for all the missions and delivery and whatnot. And yet, if you sit back a bit, you kind of wonder what's been going on, because it hasn't felt that there's been anything like the momentum that we were being promised. So it does make you wonder if there was actually a degree of behind the scenes, there was a significant kick up the backside in some respect that was needed. Was it that Darren Jones, with the industrial strategy work and the comprehensive spending review work, was it that he had somehow got under the skin of stuff a bit more? And was it therefore that you don't need two of those people doing that central delivery? But when it comes down to one of the biggest areas that this government's failed on so far is that complete climb down over welfare. And therefore, do you need to just restart? Was it that was never going to improve while you still had the same Secretary of State in? And in order to not make it look like, well, you've just been given a job in DWP, you actually create it as the new super growth department, as it's being called. And might we find out afterwards that there are other moves? And I don't know. I've not seen who Poppy's, as the investment minister's replacement is. I don't think that's been announced yet. And if that hasn't been announced yet, that is a significant part of the growth agenda, because you can talk about welfare reform and you can talk about what you're going to do on skills. But fundamentally, you still need some money coming in from other countries, and you still need business to be encouraged to spend some money in this country as part of the growth agenda. So the investment minister still not being appointed is an interesting one, particularly when you read that Poppy Gustafsson had said, or I think it was rumoured around her departure, that she had clashed with others on the agenda. She'd been struggled with some others in that Treasury team. Now, it could just be that she wanted money and Treasury was saying, can't have any, who knows? But we know that one of the biggest areas that there was a saving to be made was on welfare. And ultimately, Pat has got traction, depth of knowledge, experience, etc., and probably some fairly broad shoulders to be able to take that fight on.
I was going to ask as well, Kirsty, what is almost as interesting as who has been moved in this reshuffle is who has not been moved in this reshuffle. Ed Miliband stays as Energy Secretary, Rachel Reeves remains as Chancellor, Wes Streeting remains as Health Secretary, Bridget Phillipson remains as Education Secretary, and there's a couple of others as well. But I think those are the four that stick out in my mind as, well, you would think, based on the fact they've not moved, as examples of Sir Keir Starmer's happiness. He's looking at those people and saying, carry on, guys, doing a good job here.
Sure. I mean, the spin from Number 10 about this reshuffle, which in many ways feels like, sideways moves for lots of people. So the spin around it is actually what we've done after kind of testing this out for a year is make sure that we've got the right people now in the right roles. Now, you can argue that maybe they should have done that a year ago, but we are where we are. And so actually, if you pull that spin further out, Ed Miliband, is hugely popular within the Parliamentary Labour Party. And regardless of where you sit on the net zero debate, has almost uniquely in this Labour government, has a very clear vision for what he wants his department to deliver and a very clear mission, one of the few that we can all remember of the 5 missions, about turning Britain into a clean energy superpower. He hit the ground running. He knows the brief. He knows the stakeholders involved in it. Similarly, Wes Streeting has a clear sense of vision for what he wants to do to reform the NHS, so that makes sense too. Rachel Reeves is a separate case. She's simply untouchable at the moment. He's lashed to the mast of Number 10, or Number 10 is lashed to the mast of Rachel Reeves. So, they've tried to bolster the economic team at Number 10 to make sure that, the budget has the most fighting chance of succeeding. Bridget Phillipson, I mean, that one for me, would have been one where I arguably would have wanted to see, if you're talking about delivery, would have wanted to see someone arguably slightly more impactful. The other couple that were quite interesting, Lisa Nandy, despite the best endeavours of one particular minister to brief against her, she remains in post. So I think that one's quite fascinating. So for me, I think that is a signal that for Number 10, that they are content, that they have clear visions, and are getting on with the job of delivering on what they're set out to do.
Joe, let's return then to that idea that I've kind of had in my mind all morning, which is this a functional way for government to operate? And I get that Labour have been in for 14 months, the Conservatives were in for 14 years, but when you look around, we've had something like 11 Justice Secretaries in that time. We've had something like 6 foreign secretaries in the last 5 years. You kind of look at the situation, you go, hang on a second. When it comes to international relations and international diplomacy, this is a bit of a merry-go-round for other countries to kind of get a grip on. Actually, are we serving people well with this level of instability at the top of government? Now, Darren Jones, one of the most powerful people at the heart of government now after his 2 promotions this week, was with us on Times Radio earlier, and he was sort of making the point that on Foreign Secretary, it's the Prime Minister and the President of the United States' relationship that endures. He didn't say much actually about Yvette Cooper's own relationship with the Trump administration. However, he was emphasising that relationship at an institutional level is good. But I can't help but think all these people have in theory been making progress in these various roles for 14 months, and now they've been replaced by people who have to start basically from nothing. Does that make sense?
Well, I suppose that's the judgment on whether they've been making progress, right? And what that progress is. So I don't think we should ever suggest that people should just stay in role because of continuity. That's what the civil service are for. That's what the diplomatic service are for. That's what, there are plenty of relationships that are built at other levels. Government is not just the people that sit around the cabinet table. And to some extent, I think you should have a degree of flexibility as a government, that if you start to spot some of the challenges that are arising and the threats, when you see that the threats are changing. So when you think that, the row, for example, around Home Affairs was all about whether Rwanda was going to work or not, and a new government coming in had the sort of hangover of dealing with the Rwanda policy and then what next. But of course, the threat now being from reform and being so much stronger from reform means that you're fighting a different argument, and the argument is playing out in a different way perhaps than it was when you first came into power. So I don't think we should ever suggest that people should just stay in post But at the same time, as you discover what the challenges are and as you see where the problems are, you may well want people with different skills that then can make stuff happen and take a different tack. So, I think bringing in some new people, I think Emma Reynolds is a good appointment. It'll be interesting to see how she gets on with that brief. I think there's a lot of talk about Steve Reed moving across, staying within government, but moving across to handle things like local authorities, of which he had a lot of experience. So, even when you can see perhaps how people have handled the existing brief and gone, well, actually, yeah, move them, give them something else to do. But I do agree a bit. I don't know, Kirsty, whether you're right about people being in post, staying in post because of clear visions, or whether actually it's a problem of I can't sack them because they're popular or they're a big figure. So I might as well let them keep going. And then if they fail, they have to kind of fall on their sword anyway. And then it's their fault it went wrong because they made it clearly their vision. And therefore, if Miliband doesn't make the success of what he's doing, is it that then his reputation, his career goes with it? It's a big gamble for number 10, though, because ultimately it's your government that falls if it's all a screw up.
Kirsty, one thing to consider here then is why this has happened now. And there is one observation to make, which is that a reshuffle knocks Angela Rayner off the front pages to an extent, but it definitely took Nigel Farage and his speech at Reform UK's conference off the front pages too. I wonder to what extent this reshuffle, both on that sort of PR/media relations level, was about knocking Reform off the top spot, insofar as it was also about that politically. Do you see what I mean?
No, I don't think it's got anything to do with trying to overshadow the Reform conference. It was forced by the fact that, as we've said, this was being planned anyway, and it was an attempt to move the Rayner story off the front page more than it was to overshadow the Reform conference. But, as ever at the moment, the person that will be most delighted about, recent events will be Nigel Farage. As we've said ad nauseum, the government came in promising two fundamental things. One was the restoration of growth in our economy, and that is a subject for another day and countless podcasts to come as we head towards the budget. And the other was about the restoration of integrity in public life and the restoration of trust. And one of the reasons that the Angela Rayner issue is so damaging is obviously about it feeds into this wider public sense that, all the kind of the main political establishment is all kind of the same. It's all one rule for them and another for us, whether you're Labour government or Tory government. You get the same kind of deal. So that plays into, what is baked in as a sort of insurgent, we are different type of party. Really interesting point about this is it de-risks reform. One of the issues one of the weaknesses reform has got is precisely that it's not been in government before. That it, has no real experience of managing much at the moment outside of a couple of mayoralties and some local councils. But actually, if you've had 6 years of utter chaos under the Conservatives, previous Conservative administrations, and now you've had a good year of what only has, fallen short of the promises made to the public, but also begins to look like chaos. We've had a homeless minister that was forced to resign because she evicted her own tenants so she could jack up her rent. We've had a corruption minister who had to stand down because she's embroiled in a scandal of corruption in another country. We've had a housing secretary who's been forced to resign because she didn't pay the correct stamp duty on her new property. We've had a chief of staff being heaved out of number 10. We've had a transport secretary resigning for past indiscretions. None of this looks like stable government to the public. So on top of saying, well, they're all the same, it's one rule for them and one for us, and whether they're Labour or the Conservatives, it's the same deal. The idea of saying, well, you can't vote for reform because they've got no experience in government and it will be chaos. Well, if you're the public, you look at what you see now and say, well, and how is that different from what I had for 6 years under the Conservatives or the last year under Labour? So that de-risk thing is an absolute gift to reform, which is already kind of owning the narrative. And yes, it missed out on kind of owning the front pages today, but Tim Shipman, who's now at The Spectator, made a fascinating point over the summer where Labour completely ceded all the kind of narrative ground to reform over kind of immigration. It had 22 front pages over that 6-week summer recess. 22. For a party with 4 MPs. That is extraordinary.
They do have one very significant risk that I think we're forgetting about something that happened this week, and that is the unveiling of Nadine Dorries. And they have a very big risk that they are trying to suggest they're different from everyone else. But how different from everyone else are they going to be when they just keep bringing in people from other parties, from previous governments that have been associated with chaos?
But at the same time as they announced Nadine Dorries, they made very clear that they have turned down at least 12 other Tory MPs and ministers that have come to their door and say, can we join you? And they've also briefed why they allowed her in, why they let Jake Berry in. Jake Berry brings in all the kind of connectivity and money from a kind of northern powerhouse base. And Nadine Dorries, no matter what anybody thinks of her, is hugely popular with Daily Mail reading women, broadly speaking. And so actually that's a kind of weak flank. So they actually briefed that the downsides of having, quote unquote failed Conservatives are completely overshadowed by the upsides of some of the other things they bring to the party.
But they've also got someone who potentially is going to be contradictory to them in a policy perspective over things like online safety that she was involved in. And also she was part of the government that was sticking needles in everyone's arms through COVID. And one of their main advisors that they've got on health at the moment at Reform is somebody who's also working with RFK Jr. So you do wonder if they're going to have some serious policy conflicts. And that's all very well if you've just got a few people in the lower ranks of the party. But if you've got people that can command a front page like Nadine Dorries can, that's going to start to be pretty difficult. So Zia's going to have a hell of a job on this policy front to sort of combine all these wide views that they're bringing into the party and actually ensure that there is a course that they can chart with some credibility and some arguments that they can start to corral around. Because otherwise, if they just start having public SPACs, it's not going to help them at all.
Just got 5 minutes left of the pod then to assess what this means for the deputy leadership role within the Labour Party, which is a role that Angela Rayner has resigned from in the last 24 hours as well. And as things stand, the way that this can work going forward from here is that the Cabinet can appoint an interim deputy leader, or they can leave the post vacant until conference. But the rules do require an election. The timeline will be set by the Labour Party's NEC, the National Executive Committee, which is due to meet, we think, on Monday. And then there's sort of different views, I guess, on the length of how that process can and should be. So Labour Party conference suddenly becomes a parade of potentially deputy leaders regardless of any timing. And so there's going to be a debate. Potentially this becomes a referendum on how the Labour government is doing. Names floating around already this morning. Louise Haigh, who was on this podcast just a few weeks ago, could make something of a comeback into the higher levels of the Labour Party. Who else have we heard? Rosena Allin-Khan, the Labour MP, could also be floating her name around as well. Git O'Harry was on Times Radio this morning suggesting Angela Rayner should stand and would probably win an election to be deputy leader of the Labour Party. I think the bottom line of it, though, Kirsty, is this is going to be a very public display of a Labour Party potentially fighting with itself while all the public want are things to get better. There's a risk of that, is there not? That it becomes internal party politics and everybody's going, hang on a minute, I'm still really poor and now you've raised my taxes.
Yeah, I mean, with the exception of the latter years of the Conservatives where they all fought like ferrets in a sack over just about everything, nobody does internal fights like Labour does internal fights. So this is the kind of long tail of the Angela Rayner story that Number 10 needs like a hole in the head right now. I think any attempt to try and handle this by closing down the role of deputy leader would be insanity, and I don't think that they'll expect that for a minute. We'll all remember Jeremy Corbyn's disastrous attempts to try and remove that kind of post from Tom Watson. So I think there's two issues here. One, obviously, the leadership will want to try and coalesce around a sort of Angela Rayner-esque figure, someone who's popular on the soft. Couple of names that have, floated around and spring to mind. Ed Miliband would be one of them. He's extremely popular with the Parliamentary Labour Party and obviously is pursuing a agenda that is popular on the left wing of the Labour Party. But on the left, as you say, Rosena Allin-Khan and Louise Haigh has been quick to put herself into the frame of it. I think from Labour's point of view, their best bet on this not becoming a holy mess is the left of the Labour Party, particularly the hard left of the Labour Party, has always had a kind of People's Front of Judea quality about them. So their ability to galvanise and agree on a single candidate might be problematic. But even if they can't agree and you don't get those kind of 80 MPs, what is going to be problematic for them and is underbaked in this conversation right now is the CLPs. Yes, you only need 5 nominations from the CLPs to get onto the kind of sheet for the contest. But imagine if, someone from the left, Rosena Allin-Khan, becomes the darling of the CLPs. And you don't get, say she gets, 50 MPs supporting her nomination, but 200, 300 CLPs fight for her to be the candidate, whether she technically meets the criteria or not, you're still going to have an exposed party rift primarily over Gaza and also over welfare reform from a government that still refuses to lift the 2-child benefit cap. So all of that will be exposed. The CLPs are already in a much kind of harder left position than the leadership and government anyway. They're looking to give the government a bloody nose over Gaza. And regardless of whether they can coalesce around a candidate, that mass movement from CLPs will expose the underbelly of the divisions within the Labour Party, no matter what the NEC and Number 10 try to do about this.
So I think I can do a little edit on it, but I'm just reading the rule book 2024 that the leader and deputy leader shall be elected or re-elected from among Commons members of the PLP. So I think they do have to be MPs, which would knock out Andy Burnham with that in mind. But I think I can tidy that up if that's all right.
Sorry, I took that off Times Radio yesterday. So.
No, did you?
Yeah.
Yeah, I got it. So I had it from our reporter, and I've just looked it up in the Labour Party rule book here just to check it. So I think that's what that would mean, isn't it? Elected or re-elected from among Commons with a capital C members of the PLP.
Oh, right.
So
Parliamentary Labour Party, so it means
you
can't be, and Commons members mean you can't be a peer.
Yeah.
Do it.
So
they are specifying then. That's what that must mean.
But I can tidy that up. Is that all right with you, Kirsty, if I just tweak that?
Yeah, I don't want to give out duff information.
No, I know. But I mean, you don't want to redo it or anything. I think it's tidyable, which is why I let you keep
Do you think it's tidyable?
Definitely.
If you think it's tidyable, let's just tidy it. I mean, I can redo it if you like, but...
No, it's all good. I can tidy. And then let's just come to you on this one, Joe. Joe, this is... Let me do this again. To what extent, Joe, is this a headache for Sir Keir Starmer? The election of a new deputy leader?
And it's massive in that it completely derails your agenda for conference, because everything you're going to want to talk about is going to be it's going to be affected by the debate that's going to be going on, that is going to be led by anyone who has a position just the candidates, just the broad spectrum of candidates mean that you are going to have people I am suddenly not just a backbench MP anymore, I am a candidate for the deputy leader. And for someone like Rosena, who came second last time, she's going to be people will be looking at her saying, well, she nearly got it last time. What are her chances now? It's going to rake up all the welfare reform stuff. I thought it was really interesting that Corbyn at the beginning of the week basically said, Angela, if you get sacked, there's a place for you in our party. And yet Zara Sultana later in the week said she's not welcome. She's basically was a turncoat. Look at what she did on welfare. Look at what she's been responsible for with this government. So even the two of them in the sort of hard left new party couldn't agree about Angela Rayner and her potential value to their movements. You can see how this is going to not only talk about where the Labour Party is on different issues, but it's going to, for anybody's sort of voting record, is going to be brought up, and what they have and haven't supported that this government's been doing. And given this government hasn't exactly been pursuing a lot of issues that the left are particularly happy about, you can see that's going to be potentially a bit of a bloodbath in terms of a record. This is not just about what you might have done in the past. This is about what you did in the very recent past. And therefore, that will be a consideration for those people wanting to put themselves forward in the first place. But yeah, I would not want to be handling party management for this year's party conference in a few weeks' time, because it is, just the mechanics of this are going to be challenging. But actually, the agenda is going to be very difficult to manage.
Just before we end the podcast then, let's give you a response to Pete's point with which we started the podcast this morning, whatever time you're listening to it. Kirsty, a take from you on what Pete was saying really about business and the importance of government personnel to business. How would you respond? What would you say?
If I can sort of strangely seek to reassure Pete that the department, having worked in government, I can assure him that the department that to some certain extent matters the least in terms of its impact on business as opposed to its relationship with is the Department of Business. The two departments that matter most, I think, in this particular moment in time are obviously the Treasury, but also housing, communities and local government, weirdly, because Angela Rayner was the driving force behind the Workers' Rights Bill. That was her baby. It was her desire to push it through. The concern from business has been that that will add yet more burdens and yet more costs to businesses still reeling from the tax burdens levied upon them by Rachel Reeves in the budget last year, £25 billion worth of taxes. And I wonder whether Steve Reed, who in part was moved because he had burnt quite a lot of bridges with stakeholders at DEFRA, most notably farmers, over the inheritance tax, whether this is going to be an opportunity to either significantly water down that bill or, frankly, to shelve it altogether. So, to some certain extent, there may be hope on the horizon with that. But as ever, for businesses, what matters most is November the 26th and what happens in the budget. And in that, I suspect, again, they're going to have to brace for impact.
It'll be interesting because Steve's going to have to deal with the unions who were very unhappy about they felt that Angela Rayner wasn't going far enough in some respects. And so there was tension already, wasn't there, with the unions over some of what was seen by businesses going much further, but actually from the unions was seen as not going far enough. So that, coupled with the deputy leadership election, will be pretty interesting times. And we have also to remember, after, I think, from a business perspective, one of the things the government does have to do very quickly is to get on the front foot about the fact that you had a rule-breaking, someone who didn't pay their taxes in a senior role in government. You had that debacle over Lammy not getting his fishing licence. And, you're about to have a budget where potentially a load of taxes are going to change. And one thing that has come out of the Rayner debacle has been the suggestion that the tax system is too complicated. And I would suggest it's not just too complicated for individuals. Business find it an absolute minefield. And if that debate rages in the next few weeks, and potentially there is a little bit more consideration about what can be done to help business in that round, then that would be a good outcome for business overall.
Joe and Kirsty, thank you both very much for the unexpected, reflective podcast on what has been a dramatic few days in politics. We are very much back on the Whitehall Sources podcast after the summer recess. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you for your messages as well. Do keep in touch on email. It's hello@whitehallsources.com for you to get in touch, or you can WhatsApp us 0333 404 6507. Start your message with the word Whitehall. What is your interpretation of what this reshuffle can and should and will achieve for Sir Keir Starmer and the Labour government, if anything? We'll read your messages out on next week's podcast, and we look forward to speaking to you then.